So I mentioned in the progressive reform that that African Americans were not really a major piece of what was happening in the progressive era, and it's not that African Americans were doing nothing. It's that white progressives really did not see African Americans as a problem they could solve. Right. So you have a lot of African American progressives, Ida B. Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Mary Church Terrell. You have a lot of women that actually are part of that. Or not a lot of African Americans who are part of progressivism, but they tend to be kind of within their own society, right? In other words, Black progressivism and white progressivism had very different kind of agendas, and so they really, you don't have the weight of white progressives coming in, and a lot of this is going to be, talk about how African Americans get pretty frustrated after the Civil War when you have this decline of rights, right? Here they have in 1870 the 15th Amendment, and then you end up with them having Jim Crow. So after the Civil War, 13th, 14th, 15th, I mentioned briefly yesterday about the Redeemers, how you have Andrew Johnson. He kind of pardons a bunch of these guys. And then the Compromise of 1877 leads to kind of the replacement of a lot of these the leadership, political leadership, with some of the same guys that had led secession. Another issue that's happening after the Civil War for African Americans is they get caught up in sharecropping, right? So you have a lot of African Americans in the South that they need work, right? But they don't own anything because they haven't been allowed to own very much. Many of them, have varying degrees of literacy. And you've got these wealthy landlords or wealthy landowners that need workers. And so they create this kind of sharecropping tenant farming idea. And what that means is that if you're a tenant farmer, you're paying rent, and then you're farming. If you're a sharecropper, then you basically work on that land, and the owner kind of keeps a balanced book of all the supplies that they give you. And then he sells the crop, and when he sells the crop, he splits it with you, and he deducts from your share what you owe him for all the supplies. So tenant farming was a little better because you typically sold your own crops, but that could be pretty dangerous for African Americans, because then they would have to go to a white cotton gin or something like that, white-owned cotton gin, and that could create problems. So tenant farming and sharecropping often created a cycle of poverty that was very frustrating for a lot of African Americans. And then especially after the end of Reconstruction, when you don't have that support for them to have some local political control, and some protections from violence and some focus on education, that begins to become a problem, right? So a lot of what's going to happen is the Democrats in the South will try to pass laws, property tax, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, to try to limit African American votes, right? And so they'll do this to try to keep political control, right? And of course, I mentioned the prison system and all that kind of stuff, and laws about where people could live. One of the issues that we see is that the states can have their own requirements on voting. And so this idea of a poll tax, right, and property requirements become very popular. And progressives, because they tend to have this idea of that paternalism, we know what's best, we're going to take care of you. That kind of fits within their mindset, right, which is that that somebody, that not everyone is ready to vote, that kind of idea. And so you're going to see that that progressives really don't mind the voting restrictions, even though they're turning around and doing things like the initiative, the referendum, the recall, that's supposed to, and voting for senators, which are supposed to give people more power and more say. But you can see kind of the influence of that Anglo-Saxonism, that, well, if you're really poor, or if you're a person of color, maybe we don't need you to vote or don't want you to vote. You also have discrimination in the North. It's mostly job discrimination, housing. but you do have communities that tend to have a little more middle class, some professionals, some people that provide services to the African American community. Whereas in the South, there's a lot of economic exploitation, and you have a lot of violence. And that kind of thing. You do have places like Atlanta and Richmond and Charleston that have some small, thriving middle class communities. So it's not all poverty in the South, but there does tend to be a lot more really extreme poverty, a lot more lynching and stuff happening in the South than it does up north, although there's poverty up north too because of the discrimination. One of the biggest things that's going to happen is the Supreme Court deciding Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, saying that separate and equal is okay. This comes from Homer Plessy, who basically buys a ticket. He passes as white, right? So he's I think 1/8 African American, and so he passes and he buys a ticket, gets on the train, and after the guy takes his ticket, he's like, "Hey, I'm black," and the guy says, "Oh, well, then you got to go back to the car, the railroad car in the back." And Plessy says, "No, because you didn't care, right? Like you were fine until I told you." And so he gets arrested and fined, and this works its way through the court system. And ultimately, the Supreme Court says, "Oh no, like if Homer Plessy thinks that's unfair, then that's his problem, right? It's just his interpretation. That businesses, as long as they're providing equal services, they can segregate however they want to." And so this sets up the standard of separate but equal, and really kind of becomes known as Jim Crow. And so it's really kind of an unfortunate, really kind of solidifies that system in the South, which was already beginning to kind of take hold in small ways, but now it becomes like this official policy, or unofficial policy rather. Lynching and violence. Often, this is an execution without official and proper legal procedures. Pretty horrific things that they do with mutilation and that kind of thing. Usually what happens is it's a community in stress economically or, because of land ownership or something like that. And so a lot of times these were false accusations. They would make accusations of a woman being raped or being attacked. In almost every case, they were either outright lies or it was a consensual relationship. And so that lots of issues that take place, is to kind of check ambitions, I guess you could say, of African Americans. Some of these are very localized against a specific individual. Some cases, they target entire communities. Tulsa, for instance, Tulsa in 1921, you had the Tulsa race riot. So if you've been watching HBO's The Watchmen, it opens with that scene. So you have some real violence taking place. Now, Ida B. Wells is going to really kind of study that. And she's going to basically call attention, and the NAACP is going to call attention to the issue of lynching. And she's going to be one of those people that says, we've got to reform, we've got to do something about education. We've got to do something about poverty, but most importantly, we've got to stop lynching. And Black newspapers, Black churches are very important in kind of encouraging what in many historical circles is called uplift, right? Lifting up their race, making things better, if you will. Ida B. Wells is very interesting. She's a women's suffragette, doesn't march in the parade in 1913 because it wouldn't march in the back. Like she insisted on marching with everyone else. And NASA was so afraid that the women from South Carolina would be upset that they wouldn't agree to that. And so anyway, it's kind of interesting. So she's an interesting character. Booker T. Washington is another reformer. He focused a lot on education. He founds the Tuskegee Institute, talking about vocational skills. And he's a little bit controversial because he basically says that he kind of falls into that progressive idea that maybe African Americans aren't ready for the vote yet. They just need economic opportunity. So that's going to have some have some challenges. Like some people are not going to like that. White people like it a lot. They like hearing, oh no, they don't, African Americans don't want the vote. And so that's this idea of kind of assimilating within white society. So that's going to make him, because of the support of white society, he's going to become like the de facto spokesperson. But in reality, there's a lot of critique of what he's doing in in his particular stance. W.E.B. Du Bois he's the one who advocates for political power, says basically that it doesn't do you any good to be able to spend money if you can't protect yourself by voting for good politicians, good leaders in your community. If you have a sheriff that is going to harass you, and you can't vote for that, you can't vote for a new sheriff, then what good does it do you to have money, right? And so he definitely kind of argues for more political activity. He's one of the founders of the NAACP. In 1909, which is a progressive group. And he definitely argues he's much more kind of a radical. I put on here he believes in a different type of uplift, whereas Booker T. Washington's going to argue for that education, vocational training. Du Bois is talking about what we want is political rights. So very different approaches for African Americans. Again, progressive African Americans, they care about some of the same things that white progressives do, but white progressives, unfortunately, are not very activated to defend African Americans. So it's kind of interesting to note that this is happening alongside. It's into this context that World War I happened. So even Du Bois is a huge advocate of African Americans fighting in World War I, because as a way of proving their Americanness and their role within American society. So that's kind of where that comes in. And women's suffrage is going to matter for African American women as well as the most marginalized group with the intersection of being a woman and being African American, especially in looking at their communities that are constantly being exploited economically, facing discrimination and facing violence. So African American women are really kind of pushing, really kind of the backbone, if you will, of kind of the progressive movement for the African American community. Even though Du Bois, of course, gets a lot of attention and Booker T. Washington gets a lot of attention. But that's why I wanted a few people to look at Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells. So anyways, that takes care of African Americans. And that's pretty much it.